I think we're going to start off with a pretty interesting call. I'm curious to see how this goes. This is Nautica, who's calling in from the United States. Nautica, you are live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Hey, Dan and Godless Granny. How you doing?
Hello, I'm fine.
Good.
How are
How
you?
about yourself? Yeah.
I'm doing pretty good. Yeah, pretty good.
Cool. So what do you want to talk to us about today?
I'd like to talk to you about the scientific method and the idea of why, when questioning God's existence, how come we can't start out with the idea of like, why, God exists, and this is how we might start to go about discovering his existence, rather than God doesn't exist, so we shouldn't even begin to search.
Well, I mean, if we assume something exists, I mean, that kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, right? Because then we're just, I mean, the whole point of the scientific method is to confirm the existence of something or not. Like, if we start with the assumption, then what are we trying to prove? Does that make sense?
I think in the
that makes
scientific
perfect sense,
method, rather than starting with a conclusion, we start with a question. We
Yeah.
start with the question is, we observe that an apple falls from the tree. Why? And so the scientific method is the discovery of the answer to the question why. It doesn't start with, we know there is gravity or we know there isn't gravity. We start with the question and we work to an answer. We don't start with the answer and try to figure out why the answer is right.
Yeah. I think,
Well,
honestly,
I guess
you'll go ahead. Sorry.
I guess that would lead into another question, and I suppose the way I phrased the question shows my rudimentary understanding of the scientific method, as best as rudimentary as it is. However, I guess that would lead into another question, and the question is this: if we start out with the question, does God exist, which would seem to be a more appropriate question, does God exist? Is there any way that the both of you could come up with that we might test for an invisible God?
It's a great question.
It is. It's a great question.
For philosophy?
Yes, so there's a few problems with this question, and not saying that you're coming with a question that's problematic. What I'm saying is there's absolute difficulties with answering a question like that, right? How do we demonstrate the existence of an invisible, ununderstandable, beyond our comprehension God? Like, where do we even begin with that idea? So the problem is, under a classic, what's called empirical view, which is this idea that all of our knowledge comes from testing the world, from the scientific method, things like that, we really can't. That's kind of a big problem, right? Like, how can we know about something like that? So maybe if we take a step back and we look, okay, so what do we know about the claim of God? Well, then maybe we can get some answers there. And actually, according to most traditions of the Christian God, there are a few claims that we can look at. Godless Granny brought up a great example of this earlier when she talked about there is no evidence, absolutely none, of a global flood that happened 6,000 years ago, right? This is something that the Bible exclusively claims. And we exclusively know that that's not the case. Now, you may say, well, maybe my God isn't one of the Bible. Maybe it's not even the Christian God. And that's fine. If we're saying, oh, God is like the universe, or God is even outside the universe, well, then science can't even do anything with that. Science can only observe what's in the universe and how we interact with it, right? Our senses and everything about us is within the physical confines of the universe. So outside of that, we don't have a shot. So yeah, this is kind of a philosophically difficult problem to solve. But the Christian God in particular does have very specific claims about what he does in the physical world. And those are things that we can examine. And that's where I find major problems with believing in the Christian God, because they really don't match up with our experiences. Here's an example of this: miracles, right? Christians say that they can heal people and they can do all kinds of stuff. There's tons of stories recorded of it in the Bible. Not a single time have we ever been able to conclusively demonstrate that a miracle is the reason why somebody has been cured. We've been able to show, correlations with Tylenol relieving headaches. We've been able to show chemotherapy helping with cancer. We've never been able to show that prayer is an effective method for healing anybody. And people have studied this, right? So
There's
so that's
there's even a study that has shown that patients that were prayed for did more poorly than patients that were not prayed
yes,
for.
and that's the Templeton Foundation study
Mhm.
that demonstrated that. So yeah, that not to go into a whole thing there. I guess it's too late for me to apologize because I kind of did. But yeah, there are really interesting philosophical issues when we come to this idea of, okay, how do we measure and test God? It really just depends on what kind of God we're looking at. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, it makes perfect sense. Now, let me interject one point.
Sure.
How, shoot, I forgot the point I wanted to interject. It was a great point, and
That's
it
okay.
brought it up in my mind as you were speaking.
Maybe
But like,
maybe while you're thinking about it, if Godless Granny, did you have anything you wanted to add to what I said? Or
I was just going to kind of refine what you said is that if we're going to explore the question of does God exist, the first thing we have to do is define what we mean by God.
yeah,
And as Dan pointed out, if you're going to refer to the Christian God, then you've got to take your investigation in one direction. But if you're defining God as being a natural force or an impersonal supernatural force, your investigation is going to go in a completely different direction.
hmm totally.
now what I wanted to interject is this. What if at some point in time the God or the gods or what have you decided that, because it seems to me, and it's clearly evident that in every spiritual or supernatural biblical text, whatever you want to poem, whatever you want to refer to them as, like the gods back in the day were very actively involved in the day-to-day lives of humanity,
hmm
whereas now they're not so much. Maybe at
Right.
some point in time they decide, or she decided to adopt a sort of TNG kind of next generation crime directive until we become so advanced that at the very least, that we're in peace with each other. Maybe they won't interact with us.
Yeah.
Or
So, oh, go ahead.
or maybe the gods realized that we had no need of them anymore, so they left to go find someone that did need them.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
in Christian theology, this actually refers to a very specific idea. This is called dispensationalism. And what dispensationalism says is, look, there was this time where God and angels and demons were all interacting with the world and all doing this stuff. But sometime after the death of Jesus, maybe after the Pentecost and shortly after the stint with the apostles, that kind of just stopped, right? And there's folks who say, yeah, dispensationalism kind of describes that, yeah, God literally just doesn't interact with the world in the same way because maybe he doesn't need to. Maybe Jesus and his message is enough to kind of cover for things. I say maybe it's also because the better that we got an understanding of this thing called science, and the better that we had ways of tracking the world, suddenly using God as an explanation for anything maybe kind of started making less and less sense. I mean, the thing is, right? You mentioned, well, it seems like there's cultures all around the world who talked about God working in person and then that kind of stops later. But there's still cultures today that say that there are gods working in people's lives, right? Like that actually hasn't really stopped. It's just the way in which we describe God has worked in people's lives. If you look at the Old Testament, God literally wrestles with a guy named Jacob. That's not a metaphor. He literally like does WWE with Jacob and like breaks his elbow or something. What does he break? He breaks his
His
leg
thigh,
or
his
his
thigh.
thigh. Thank you. He breaks his thigh. Okay, that's kind of awesome. But also, not a view of God that you would hear a pastor say today. A pastor today is going to say, "Yeah, God help me find my keys." It's not going to be like, "Oh, I just wrestled with God last Tuesday, and we broadcasted that on pay-per-view, and it was awesome." Like, I think our understanding of how God even works in our lives changes because we kind of have to reconcile what we know about the world, right? I understand maybe it could be a violation of a prime directive, but maybe also we just found better ways to look at stuff and found, oh, these God explanations maybe aren't the best for explaining things, right? I don't know. There's different ways to look at this.
So now I'd like to ask the both of you, Godless Granny and Dan. I've heard this discussed and tackled a couple of different ways on the different shows put on by the ACA.
Mhm.
Do you think it's God's responsibility to interact with us and reveal himself to humanity because of all the genocide and all the everything that he's kind of taken credit for? Or do you think it's our responsibility to plead and implore him to reveal himself to us and kind of get our shit together so he can? I mean, like, or at least do you think he'll have any kind of good explanation to give to us on
I
on
think
that
I think
judgment
that
day as to
depends.
why?
I think that depends entirely on God's goals.
Mhm.
If God's intent is that people believe in Him, if that truly is a goal of God's, then it's His responsibility to reveal Himself in such a way that's possible. And if God doesn't care what people believe about Him, then no, He bears no such responsibility.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it seems like most of the Christian tradition does say that God is interested in having a relationship with humans. I mean, he sent his son to die on the cross for us, right? Like that's this narrative that's told because, oh, he loves us actually. Like he really wants to be with us and he gives us that choice. And for some reason, there wasn't any problem when Jesus was on earth and doing miracles and talking to people and demonstrating God's power. But for some reason, that's a problem today in 2023, which I think is kind of interesting. Because I don't know, what we can't get angels or something. I mean, like, not saying it has to be an everyday thing, but at least like a press conference or something, right? Just to like clear up the air. Because as far as I know, it's been a while since the big man upstairs has been down here on Earth, if he was ever here at all. But yeah, I 100% agree if he is interested in a relationship with us, there's definitely better ways to do it. And if he's going to send us to hell too, if we don't, then yeah, that seems like you want to put your best foot forward there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for chatting with me, guys. It was fun. I hope to see
Yeah,
you again.
you asked a couple really great questions, so
Thank you for calling.
I enjoyed that a lot. Thanks again for calling in, Natica. Hope we helped you out on your journey wherever you're at.